This is the Ford Mustang EcoBoost, and it's the first time Ford has offered a turbocharged Mustang in 30 years. In reality, this configuration exists so Ford can sell the Mustang as a global car now, but in our little fantasy world, let's pretend the Mustang has a turbo because it's extra friendly to the aftermarket. But in order to see what it's like in the real world, we've brought Ford's best turbocharged offering so far, the 2014 Fiesta ST that's been all done up for the ball by Cobb Tuning. Is the Mustang and its rear-wheel drive turbocharged layout worth switching away from the world's most manic hatchback? The only way to find out is to go for a drive.
When it comes to small turbocharged fun, the Fiesta ST sets a new high watermark in the hot hatchback segment here in the US. It comes pretty severely underrated from the factory with quite a bit of horsepower and torque. It only weighs 2,700 pounds, and it has steering feel that makes NSX owners blush. On a road like this, you can point and squirt your way to the biggest smile imaginable. And even if you're not that into front-wheel drive, there's no way to not have a good time driving this car. It just tells you so much about what's going on, and it feeds you power in a most wonderful way with an unbelievable shove of torque in the mid-range, right where you want to use it on a road. Ford put a really small turbo in this car from the factory, which is great for making low and mid-range torque, but it tends to die at the top of the power band. That's why this car isn't exactly a rock star on the track, where your RPMs are all the way at the top of the tack. But on a road, when you're using more off-throttle, more mid-range throttle, and pulling out of a slow corner, that torque makes this thing feel like an absolute rocket ship. Of course, I have modified this car quite a bit. It has what they call the Cobb Stage 3 package, which, although that sounds advanced, is really just an intake, exhaust, intercooler, and a tune. The Stage 3 package is good for roughly 20 horsepower and 50 pounds of torque on standard 91 octane fuel. And that's on stock hardware. We have changed no moving parts. All you got to do to this engine to wake it up is to feed it more fuel, feed it more air, and let it wind loose. And now, it'll blow the tires off all the way through second gear, some of the way through third gear, and if it's wet out, into fourth gear. Oh man, this car is so good. If you want to come out here on a road like this and get away from me, you had better bring a really fast car. Corner's so flat, steering is perfect. Exactly what I want from a sports car. It's fun, feedback. I love rear-wheel drive, but you cannot beat this level of feedback in a car. What's happened here is Ford has delivered us a fast car from the factory, but they've left some on the table for us to play with. Even with 1.6 liters, oh yes. This thing now has a power to weight ratio about that of a Lotus Elise, and it gets around corners nearly as quickly. So what will happen when they stick a turbo in the Mustang? Let's talk tuning for a second, shall we? With just an intake, an intercooler, an exhaust, and a tune, we were able to make 218 horsepower and 283 pounds of torque at the wheels in this little 2,700 pound car. Just a 1.6. Apply that logic to the 2.3 turbo in this car, and you could be making 350 to 375 horsepower and like 400 pounds of torque out of a 4-cylinder Mustang. That's as much torque as the GT in a car that weighs 170 pounds less. Yes. This is not the first turbocharged Mustang. If you know your history, you know about the Mustang SVO from the mid-1980s. And at the time, that 2.3 liter turbocharged engine was the top of Mustang performance lineup. It was above the GT. That's a little different now. The GT is the top here with its 435 horsepower 5 liter V8, as well it should be. But this one is very, very cool in its own way. First off, just like the SVO, It has a 2.3-liter turbocharged engine. It's mounted longitudinally, and that means, of course, rear-wheel drive. This particular one has the optional 355 axle ratio, and it's got an automatic gearbox, which I'm a fan of in certain circumstances, but not in others. I like the torque band of this car. Good brakes too. You save about 170 pounds here versus the GT. You also get better fuel economy, and you have the pleasure of having an oddball. A Mustang has never been kind of an oddball. It's always been, oh, you want a cheap V8 car, you know, here's your go-to. You know, and they've always had that V8 to lean on. Now, with an independent rear suspension, a turbocharged engine, and a paddle shift gearbox, all of a sudden the Mustang has become a modern car pretty much overnight. Inside here is really nice. If you took a futuristic movie car's interior from like the 80s versus what we actually get in an interior today, I think the real world has come out ahead of Fantasyland in most cases. But especially with the Mustang, because now everything I touch is soft. It's well insulated in here. There's obviously no squeaks or rattles, but the materials are nice, except for one thing. When we drove the GT, I was so happy they made the door uppers soft, and in the EcoBoost, they're hard again. So I guess you have to buy the GT if you want soft doors. Even though it's only 170 pounds lighter, you really do feel it in the corners. It doesn't have that same kind of top-heavy feel that the GT has. A little more balanced, a little more spry. It's still got the sort of artificially heavy electronic steering, but just like the GT, super accurate. And look at this, on these bumpy roads, on that road, that section right there, last year a Mustang would have been a mess. This thing, point, go, point, go. Which would I prefer? For me, I like the Fiesta because it's just so involved. I can't ignore the lack of involvement from this car. And it's not that it's not fun to drive, it is, but the steering doesn't tell me much. The automatic gearbox doesn't make me feel like I have as much control as I would. It's heavier. I mean, even at 3,500 pounds, which is reasonably light for the segment, it's still a lot heavier than the Fiesta. And it's even heavier than the BMW 228, which I love. There's no getting around the fact that the Mustang is a 3,500 pound car. It's actually heavier than the BMW M4 by about 100 pounds. It's 800 pounds heavier than the Fiesta. And in the tight corners, you certainly do feel the difference. The Fiesta's sprightlier, it's more manic, it's more eager. On the other hand, weight means more features, better insulation, and a better sense of luxury. So while I would rather spend an afternoon in the canyons driving the Fiesta, I'd rather go on a long highway road trip in the Mustang.